How many times did our translator cover for us before we got her deported? Lena Volkov had been fixing our mistakes since she joined Apex Global Solutions as the Russian translator 3 years ago. Every contract dispute where we'd promised deliverables we couldn't meet, every client dinner where our executives got drunk and said things that could end partnerships, every legal document where the English and Russian versions didn't match because we'd changed terms without telling anyone. Lena smoothed it over in flawless Russian, adjusting translations in real time to hide our incompetence from clients who were investing millions based on what they thought we'd promised. I watched her do it at least 20 times in the 2 years I'd been with the company. She'd sit in conference rooms with her tablet and headphones, translating our CEO's presentations while simultaneously editing out the parts where he contradicted himself or made claims about capabilities we didn't have. She'd rewrite contract clauses during negotiations to match what clients expected, rather than what our legal team had actually drafted. She'd take late-night calls from angry Moscow partners and convince them that shipping delays were customs issues, rather than our failure to manufacture products on time. Every time, we thanked her and moved on with our deals intact, never acknowledging that Lena was committing fraud to protect our revenue streams and our jobs. The night everything collapsed was a Thursday in November, when our executive team took the Volkov Industries delegation to an upscale steakhouse downtown. Volkov Industries was our biggest client, representing 40% of annual revenue, and they'd flown in from Moscow to finalize a $50 million expansion contract. Our CEO, Dennis Carver, had been drinking since the afternoon meeting, celebrating the deal before signatures were finalized. By dinner, he was loud and reckless, making jokes that didn't translate well, and getting increasingly aggressive when the Volkov team asked technical questions about implementation timelines. Lena sat between Dennis and the delegation head, Mikhail Volkov, translating Dennis's responses while visibly editing his slurred words into coherent answers. I was there as the operations manager, watching this disaster unfold across the table. Mikhail asked Dennis directly about quality control failures that had affected 3 previous shipments, issues that had cost Volkov Industries over $2 million in delayed production. Dennis waved his hand dismissively and said something about Russian infrastructure being the real problem, that if they had better ports and logistics, our products would arrive intact. Lena's face went completely still before she translated something entirely different, explaining that we'd identified the packaging vulnerabilities and implemented new protocols that would prevent future damage. Mikhail seemed satisfied with Lena's translation, but Dennis kept drinking and talking, getting progressively worse as dinner continued. He started complaining about immigration policy, saying we had too many foreign workers who didn't understand American business practices. He looked directly at Lena when he said it, adding that at least she was useful for making Russians think we knew what we were talking about. Lena translated none of this, instead redirecting the conversation to dessert options and coffee preferences. Our VP of Sales, Trevor Grant, was texting frantically under the table, probably to our PR team, trying to figure out how to contain whatever Dennis said next. The Volkov delegation seemed relaxed, trusting Lena's translations completely, unaware that our CEO was actively insulting them in English, while she fed them reassuring lies in Russian. After dinner, as we walked to the parking garage, Dennis pulled out his phone and started recording a video message to send to the board, bragging about closing the Volkov deal and making crude comments about how easy it was to manipulate foreign clients who didn't speak English well. He was loud enough that Mikhail and his team could hear him, though they couldn't understand the words. Lena stepped between them quickly, her back to the Volkov group, and asked Dennis to put his phone away. He ignored her and kept recording, laughing about how we'd sold them products that barely met Russian safety standards and charged premium prices. Lena did something I'd never seen her do before. She took Dennis's phone right out of his hand, deleted the video, and told him he was too drunk to make business decisions. Dennis grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks and demanded his phone back, calling her an immigrant who needed to remember her place. Trevor and I pulled Dennis away while Lena handed the phone to me without saying anything. Her expression was completely neutral, professional, giving nothing away. But I saw her hands shaking when she turned back to Mikhail and his team, apologizing in Russian for the delay and saying Dennis had received an urgent family call. The Volkov delegation left shortly after, seeming satisfied with the evening, trusting that whatever they'd witnessed had been handled appropriately. Trevor arranged for a car to take Dennis home, and the rest of us stood in the parking garage in silence, understanding that Lena had just saved a $50 million contract by physically intervening with our CEO and lying to our biggest clients about what they'd seen. I drove Lena back to the office so she could get her car, and during the 20-minute drive, she said exactly 3 sentences. Dennis has been drinking at client meetings for 8 months. I've been covering for him since March. This was the worst it's been. The next morning, Lena didn't show up to work. Her desk was empty, her computer logged off, and her keycard showed no entry attempts. Trevor called her phone repeatedly, getting voicemail every time. By 10 a.m., Dennis was in his office, apparently sober and furious about what had happened the previous night. He called Trevor and me in separately, demanding to know why we'd let Lena take his phone and delete his video. I explained that she'd been protecting him from recording evidence of contract fraud, that everything he'd said about manipulating Volkov Industries could have been used against the company in litigation. Dennis didn't care about legal exposure. He cared that an employee had physically taken his property and deleted his content. He said he was reporting the incident to HR as theft and insubordination. Trevor tried to explain that Lena had saved the Volkov contract, but Dennis cut him off. He said Lena had overstepped her role as a translator, that her job was to translate words, not to manage his behavior or make decisions about what clients should hear. He wanted her terminated immediately. Trevor pushed back, pointing out that Lena's visa status was tied to her employment with Apex, that firing her would trigger immigration consequences. Dennis smiled when he said that maybe Lena should have considered those consequences before taking his phone. HR called me at 2 p.m. asking for a statement about the incident. I sat in a conference room with our HR director, Patricia Wynn, and described what happened at dinner and in the parking garage. I tried to emphasize that Lena had been protecting the company from massive legal liability, that Dennis had been creating evidence of fraud while intoxicated. Patricia took notes without expression, asking specific questions about whether Lena had Dennis's permission to take his phone, whether she'd returned it immediately, whether clients had witnessed the interaction. I answered honestly, knowing each answer was building a case for Lena's termination rather than Dennis's accountability. Patricia thanked me and said they'd be conducting additional interviews before making employment decisions. I asked what would happen to Lena's visa if she was terminated. Patricia explained that Apex would file the necessary paperwork with immigration authorities, that Lena would have 60 days to find alternative employment sponsorship or leave the country voluntarily. I sat there processing the reality that we were about to destroy Lena's life to protect a CEO who'd spent 3 years using her to commit fraud. I asked if there was any way to resolve this without termination. Patricia said the decision was above her level, that executive leadership would determine appropriate consequences. Lena was fired on Friday afternoon via email. The message was professionally worded, thanking her for her service and explaining that recent conduct violations had led to the termination of her employment effective immediately. They'd already deactivated her keycard and computer access. Her final paycheck would include unused vacation time and severance equivalent to 2 weeks' salary. The email didn't mention her visa status or the immigration implications, though everyone involved knew exactly what this meant. I tried calling Lena after seeing the email, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I sent a text apologizing and asking if there was anything I could do to help. She responded 3 hours later with a single sentence. "You could have told the truth about what Dennis has been doing for 3 years instead of letting me take the fall alone." The message felt like a punch to the chest because she was completely right. I'd watched Lena cover for Dennis's drinking, his incompetence, his fraud, and I'd said nothing because my own job depended on those same contracts staying intact. I'd benefited from every lie she told, every translation she manipulated, every client she convinced to trust us despite Dennis's failures. And when it came time to protect her, I'd given HR exactly the information they needed to justify her termination. The weekend passed in a blur of guilt and avoidance. I didn't reach out to Lena again because I couldn't figure out what to say that wouldn't sound like meaningless apology from someone who'd helped destroy her life. Monday morning, Trevor pulled me into his office and closed the door. He looked worse than I'd ever seen him, exhausted and agitated in ways that went beyond just losing a valuable employee. He told me that Mikhail Volkov had called that morning asking to speak with Lena directly about some contract clarifications. Trevor had to explain that Lena no longer worked for the company, and Mikhail's tone had changed immediately. He'd asked why Lena was terminated, whether it was connected to the dinner incident, whether there were problems with the Volkov contract that Lena had been hiding. Trevor said he'd tried to reassure Mikhail that everything was fine, that Lena's termination was unrelated to their business relationship. But Mikhail had ended the call saying he needed to review all previous translations and contracts before proceeding with the expansion deal. The $50 million contract was now on hold pending their internal review, exactly the outcome we'd been trying to avoid. Dennis called an emergency executive meeting that afternoon, demanding to know how to salvage the Volkov deal without Lena. Trevor explained that we needed to provide the Volkov team with accurate translations of all previous contracts and communications, that their trust in our partnership was based on Lena's work, and her sudden absence was triggering doubts about everything we'd told them. Dennis said we'd hire a new translator immediately, someone who could review the files and confirm everything was accurate. I watched this conversation happen and felt something break inside me because everyone in that room knew our previous contracts weren't accurate. We knew Lena had been adjusting translations to hide our failures, and now we were planning to hire someone else to verify work that was intentionally fraudulent. I asked what would happen when the new translator found discrepancies between English and Russian versions. Dennis said we'd handle that when it happened, that the priority was keeping Volkov Industries satisfied while we sorted out minor translation inconsistencies. The meeting ended with assignments for damage control, and I walked back to my desk knowing I was either going to become complicit in covering up fraud, or I was going to lose my job by refusing. That night, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line said, "You asked if you could help." I opened it and found a message from Lena explaining that she'd spent 3 years documenting every time Apex had asked her to manipulate translations, every contract where English and Russian versions didn't match, every client dinner where she'd covered for executive misconduct. She'd kept copies of original documents and her altered translations, time-stamped and organized by client and contract value. She'd recorded audio from meetings where Dennis had instructed her to change terms without informing clients, where Trevor had asked her to mistranslate quality control reports, where I'd requested she minimize shipping delay explanations. She had everything. 3 years of evidence showing systematic fraud across our entire international business division. Lena's email explained that she'd been documenting this for self-protection, understanding that her visa status made her vulnerable, and that the company could terminate her at any time. She'd never intended to use the evidence unless she needed to defend herself. Now that Apex had fired her and triggered her deportation, she was giving me the choice of what to do with the information. She'd attached a folder containing sample documents showing the scale of the fraud. She wrote that I could bring everything to regulators and law enforcement, or I could stay silent and let her be deported while Apex continued defrauding clients. She said the decision was mine because I was the one who'd asked if there was anything I could do to help. I spent that entire night reviewing the files Lena had sent. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized. She documented 73 separate instances where Apex had asked her to manipulate translations to hide contract violations, product defects, safety failures, and financial misrepresentations. The Volkov Industries contracts alone contained 19 discrepancies where the Russian version promised specifications and timelines that the English version didn't include. We'd been systematically overcharging them for substandard products while Lena's translations convinced them they were getting what they'd paid for. Other clients had similar patterns. Millions in contracts built on fraudulent translations that would never have been signed if clients had known what the English versions actually said. Lena's recordings from executive meetings were even more damning. Dennis's voice explaining that foreign clients were easy targets because they relied on translators and didn't understand American contract law. Trevor discussing how to use Lena's translations to obscure product testing failures. My own voice asking Lena to downplay shipping delays in her translations to Russian clients, knowing the delays were caused by our manufacturing incompetence rather than logistics issues. Every conversation had dates, times, participants, and outcomes, showing that Apex's international division was built on fraud facilitated by exploiting Lena's vulnerable immigration status. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop reading through evidence that would destroy the company and everyone who worked there, including me. By 6 a.m., I decided that staying silent would make me fully complicit in Lena's deportation and the ongoing fraud against clients who trusted us. I called an attorney I'd worked with on a previous job, someone I trusted to give me honest advice. Her name was Diane Corey, and she specialized in corporate law and whistleblower protections. I explained the situation in broad terms over the phone, and she told me to come to her office immediately with all the documentation I had. We met at 9 a.m., and I spent 4 hours walking her through Lena's evidence files while she took detailed notes and asked questions about my own involvement. Diane explained that what Lena had documented constituted wire fraud, contract fraud, and potentially securities fraud if any of the false contracts had been used in financial reporting to investors or banks. The criminal liability extended to everyone who knew about the fraudulent translations and allowed them to continue. That included me. She said I could cooperate with law enforcement as a witness, which would provide some protection, but I'd still face professional consequences and possible civil liability from clients who'd been defrauded. I asked what would happen to Lena if I came forward with this information. Diane said Lena's immigration status was complicated by her termination, but if she was cooperating with a federal investigation into fraud, prosecutors might be able to work with immigration authorities to delay her deportation or provide a U visa for crime victims cooperating with law enforcement. Nothing was guaranteed, but it was more of a chance than Lena had if I stayed silent and let the deportation proceed. Diane drafted a letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI outlining the allegations and offering my cooperation in exchange for consideration as a witness rather than a defendant. We spent the afternoon preparing my testimony, going through every instance I'd personally witnessed of Lena being asked to manipulate translations. By evening, Diane had sent formal notifications to both agencies, and I'd committed to testifying about 3 years of fraud at the company where I still worked. I drove home feeling sick and clear-headed at the same time, understanding I'd just destroyed my career, but might have given Lena a chance to avoid deportation. The FBI contacted Diane's office the next morning requesting an immediate interview. Special Agent Omar Rashid met with us at Diane's office that afternoon, bringing another agent who specialized in white-collar crime. I spent 6 hours providing testimony about Apex's fraudulent translation practices, walking them through Lena's documentation and explaining the corporate culture that had made this possible. Agent Rashid was particularly interested in the Volkov Industries contracts because they represented international wire fraud with values exceeding federal prosecution thresholds. He asked detailed questions about who knew about the fraudulent translations, who had authority to stop them, and who had profited from the contracts they enabled. I answered everything honestly, including my own complicity in requesting altered translations and remaining silent, while Lena covered for executive misconduct. Agent Rashid explained that the investigation would take months to complete, that they'd need to verify Lena's documentation and interview other employees before taking enforcement action. He asked if I was willing to wear a recording device and gather additional evidence from ongoing conversations at Apex. I agreed because I'd already destroyed my ability to work there, and collecting more evidence might strengthen the case that could help Lena. Going back to work on Wednesday, knowing I was cooperating with the FBI felt surreal and terrifying. I met with Agent Rashid in a parking garage before my shift, and he gave me a recording device that looked like a regular smartphone charging cable. He instructed me to keep it plugged into my work laptop during meetings and client calls, that it would capture audio within a 15-foot radius. He warned me not to take unnecessary risks or try to prompt incriminating statements, just to document normal business operations. The device stayed plugged in at my desk for the next 3 weeks, recording every executive meeting, every client call, and every conversation about how to handle the Volkov Industries contract without Lena. The recordings captured Dennis instructing the new translator to match Russian translations to whatever version kept clients happy, Trevor discussing strategies to hide product defects and technical specifications, and multiple conversations about how to prevent clients from comparing English and Russian contract versions directly. Agent Rashid collected the device every Friday and returned it Monday morning with fresh recording capacity, building a case one conversation at a time. Lena's deportation hearing was scheduled for early December, 6 weeks after her termination. Diane had filed emergency motions requesting a stay of deportation based on Lena's cooperation with a federal investigation, but immigration courts moved on their own timelines and didn't always coordinate with criminal investigations. I attended the hearing as a witness, prepared to testify about Lena's cooperation and the circumstances of her termination. The immigration judge was a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Victoria Landry, who'd clearly heard thousands of deportation cases and wasn't inclined toward sympathy. Lena's immigration attorney, Marcus Holbrook, presented evidence of her cooperation with the FBI investigation and argued that deporting her would interfere with ongoing federal law enforcement activities. The government's immigration attorney countered that Lena had been terminated for cause from her sponsoring employer, that she'd had 60 days to find alternative sponsorship and had failed to do so, and that cooperation with unrelated investigations didn't override immigration violations. Judge Landry asked Lena directly if she'd secured alternative employment with visa sponsorship. Lena said no, that her termination from Apex had made her effectively unemployable in her field because prospective employers wouldn't sponsor someone who'd been fired for cause. I took the stand and testified about the actual circumstances of Lena's termination, explaining that she'd been fired for refusing to facilitate fraud rather than for any legitimate performance issue. Judge Landry asked if I'd provided this information to immigration authorities when Apex filed their termination paperwork. I admitted I hadn't, that I'd remained silent while the company processed her termination with immigration as a standard employment separation. The judge's expression made clear what she thought of my delayed honesty. She asked why I was testifying now, and I told her the truth. Because Lena had given me evidence of systematic fraud and asked if I wanted to help, and I'd realized that the only way to actually help was to stop being complicit in the system that had exploited her. Judge Landry took a brief recess before returning with her ruling. She said that while she appreciated Lena's cooperation with federal investigators, immigration law didn't provide exceptions for employment-based visa holders who lost their sponsorship, regardless of circumstances. However, given the ongoing federal investigation and the possibility that Lena's testimony would be needed for prosecution, she was granting a 90-day extension before deportation to allow law enforcement time to determine if Lena qualified for a U visa as a crime victim cooperating with investigation. The extension wasn't much, but it meant Lena had 3 more months before being forced to leave the country permanently. The FBI executed search warrants at Apex Global Solutions on a Friday morning in late December, seizing computers, files, and financial records. Federal agents interviewed 17 employees, including Dennis, Trevor, and everyone else in the international division. The company's stock price dropped 34% when news broke that they were under investigation for international fraud. Dennis hired a criminal defense attorney and stopped coming to the office. Trevor was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. I was terminated the following week for violating confidentiality agreements by cooperating with law enforcement, though Diane had anticipated this and already filed wrongful termination claims. The company tried to argue I'd stolen proprietary information by providing Lena's documentation to investigators, but Diane countered that whistleblower protections prevented retaliation for reporting criminal activity. The lawsuit would take years to resolve, but at least I had legal representation and wasn't facing deportation. Apex's other international clients started reviewing their contracts after the FBI investigation became public. A German manufacturing firm hired independent translators to compare English and German versions of their agreements and found similar discrepancies to what Lena had documented with Russian translations. A French aerospace contractor discovered that technical specifications in French promised capabilities that English versions didn't include. Within 3 months, Apex faced 9 separate lawsuits from international clients seeking damages for fraudulent contracts, with total claims exceeding $200 million. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in March, unable to maintain operations while fighting multiple fraud allegations. Over 300 employees lost their jobs when Apex dissolved, including people who'd had nothing to do with the international division, but were casualties of the systematic fraud that senior leadership had built the company around. Lena's U visa application was approved in February, after federal prosecutors confirmed she was a material witness in multiple fraud cases, and that her cooperation was essential for prosecution. The visa didn't erase what had happened or restore the 3 years she'd spent enabling fraud while fearing for her immigration status, but it meant she could stay in the country legally and wouldn't be deported. She found work with a legal translation service that specialized in immigration cases, using her experience to help other immigrants navigate the system that had nearly destroyed her. We met for coffee in April, the first time I'd seen her since the deportation hearing. She looked different. harder in ways that came from surviving something that should have destroyed her. We talked carefully about the investigation, the bankruptcy, and the trials that would start later in the year. Lena said Marcus was helping her file civil claims against Apex's leadership for labor exploitation and immigration-related damages, though the bankruptcy would probably prevent her from recovering anything substantial. I apologized for my complicity in her exploitation. For the years I'd watched her cover for our failures and said nothing, for only acting when she'd already been fired and faced deportation. Lena accepted the apology without forgiving it, explaining that acknowledgement was important but didn't erase the harm done. She said the hardest part wasn't the deportation threat or the 3 years of fraud, but the realization that everyone she'd worked with had known she was vulnerable and had used that vulnerability to make her complicit in crimes that could have resulted in prison time if she'd ever refused. She'd protected us because refusing would have meant immediate termination and deportation, and we'd exploited that trapped position systematically for years. I asked what I could have done differently, and Lena said the truth. That I could have told the truth about what was happening the first time Dennis asked her to manipulate a translation, instead of waiting until she'd been fired and giving evidence only when it might help her avoid deportation. She said speaking up when it cost something was the only version of help that actually mattered. The criminal trial started in September, nearly a year after Lena's termination. Dennis faced 23 federal fraud charges related to the systematic translation manipulation and false contracts. Trevor faced 18 charges for his role in facilitating and covering up the fraud. 3 other executives were charged with conspiracy and wire fraud. I testified for the prosecution in Dennis's trial, walking the jury through 3 years of fraudulent practices and explaining how Apex had exploited Lena's immigration vulnerability to build an international business division on false contracts. The defense tried to argue that translation discrepancies were honest mistakes rather than intentional fraud, but Lena's recordings destroyed that narrative. The jury heard Dennis's own voice explaining how to target foreign clients who relied on translators, how to structure contracts that looked different in English and Russian, how to use Lena's fear of deportation to ensure she'd never refuse or report them. The convictions came quickly. Dennis received 15 years in federal prison. Trevor received 11 years. The other executives received sentences ranging from 6 to 9 years depending on their level of involvement. The civil lawsuits from defrauded clients continued for years, with settlements eventually totaling over $180 million paid out by Apex's insurance carriers and the personal assets of convicted executives. Lena's civil case against Apex leadership settled for $750,000, a fraction of what she deserved but more than most whistleblowers received in immigration-related exploitation cases. She used part of the settlement to fund a nonprofit organization providing legal support for immigrant workers facing exploitation and deportation threats. I started working for that nonprofit as a case manager in my late 20s, helping document exploitation patterns and connecting workers with legal resources before their situations became catastrophic. The work felt like inadequate penance for years of complicity, but Lena said movements toward justice always started with people who'd been complicit choosing to stop. 3 years after Lena's deportation hearing, I attended a legal symposium where she was speaking about immigration vulnerability and labor exploitation. She stood at the podium and explained how employers weaponized visa status to coerce immigrant workers into illegal activity, how the threat of deportation created compliance that employers exploited systematically, and how the only solution was structural reform that protected immigrant workers from retaliation. Someone in the audience asked how to identify exploitation before it escalated to crisis, and Lena said the answer was simple. If you're asking someone to do something they'd be fired for refusing, you're exploiting their vulnerability. If you're staying silent while watching that exploitation happen, you're complicit in their victimization. She said the question wasn't whether individual workers would eventually hit breaking points that destroyed them, but whether the people around them would speak up before those breaking points arrived. She looked directly at me when she said it, not with forgiveness but with expectation that I'd remember what silence cost and choose differently when it happened again. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too, so subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.